I know that, historically within sociology, evolution has kind of taken on because of social Darwinism, people, it doesn't look pretty. Now you're kind of bringing it back, but dropping all those, terrible assumptions people made before. How has the reception been within sociology with your work in sociobiology?
It's a tough sell because of those prejudices. But these prejudices are based upon no reading whatsoever. And I'm very critical in fact, I'm very critical of sociobiology, if that's the term you want to use. I don't use it. Or in evolutionary psychology, I'm extremely critical of them because their whole model's wrong. It doesn't, the brain's not that way. And it doesn't work for sociocultural systems. I'm proposing an entirely different way from those points of view of looking at evolution and looking at the basis of biological basis of human behavior and ultimately social organization. It's not a determinative relationship, but there is something there. And my whole approach to evolution is I think, so far, so much better than what you see from the big names like E.O. Wilson and whatnot, who try to get into some of these biologists and psychologists try to get into sociology, and they're just idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. And if you're a sociologist, you're always attuned to the fact that there's levels of reality, physical, biological, and sociocultural, all these levels. Everything, there's all kinds of emergent properties always happen. So nothing is determinative by some biological thing. But most of what biology does is facilitate. But it also does put certain pressures on humans to behave in certain ways. Doesn't mean they have to behave that way. Humans are pretty flexible. They can be oppressed for a long time before they get up and do something about it. So what I'm trying to do is bring biology back in a sane way, but the prejudices of the past are pretty heavy. I think younger people are not so prejudiced. I find that they're quite open to it, but people maybe my age, say down to 55, may have some of those prejudices still. Mm-hmm. All based upon a bunch of stuff they've never read. They've probably never read Spencer. He wasn't a social Darwinist. And actually, William Graham Sumner was a social Darwinist. And even Charles Martin Cooley for a while was a social Darwinist. These papers I wrote for the American Sociologists with Russell Shute tries to explain all this to people if they read them. What the real history of this is. But people aren't interested in that. They got their prejudices and they're happy with them.
Well, I'm curious of your thoughts on the recent work by Nicholas Christakis, his book on Blueprint, which is actually pretty popular in mainstream. You guys are writing on similar topics. Curious to know what you think about his idea of the social suite.
It's a good idea. It's pretty general. In fact, when you mentioned this, when you're going to ask this, I pulled a page out of my human nature book just because I want to have all the elements of the suite. I mean, it's actually a fascinating book. I enjoyed reading it immensely. It actually is making a very simple point. In some ways, it's over illustrated, but the illustrations are so interesting, and he's such an engaging writer. I can forgive him for that because there's a fun book to read. So he's saying there's this suite of behaviors. There's a sweet spot for cooperative, altruistic, integrative behavior. And so what are they? Recognize individual identity, love for parents and offspring, friendship, cooperation, patience for one's own group and group bias, mild hierarchy, relative egalitarianism, and social learning. Okay, that's pretty general stuff. I think he's right, basically. But if you actually think about it, achieving the right balance among those things is not so easy. When you organize, any group or organization you belong to, these don't always work quite if you want them to work. Think about American society right now. This is a very difficult suite, and I think he's right. When you have all these things going, you're going to have a pretty integrated, altruistic pattern of social organization. And so it's fine as far as it goes. And what I think the book's fascinating about is he can document this suite, operation of this suite, and very different kinds of circumstances, all of which are very interesting. He's a really good writer and really says things very well. And I don't think it will surprise any sociologists, but that's a little bit different than what I've been trying to do. When on the book of Human Nature, my goal was to try to say, we are an organism that evolved like any other organism, and we have a biological basis, and that and even though we are an animal that creates culture and has language and culture, and not only that, we have big brains, we also have a big emotional part of our brains. That does make us a little bit different, but we're still a biological animal. And I was interested in finding out what's the biology of what drives us. What has a biological basis? It's always going to be conflated slightly by language and culture and cognition, high degrees of cognition and emotions. But it's still going to be there. And it has a subtle effect on what humans need and want. And it's not, this is more of a structural thing. I'm talking about, what I end up talking about is 5 complexes around cognitions, emotions, interaction, psychological needs, and community. Comes to the primate stuff I know about great apes. So the idea was what you could do with cladistic analysis, given that we share 99 point something % of our genes with chimpanzees, 98 with gorillas, 97 with orangutans, and gorillas share more in common with us than they do with the other 2 great apes. We know then that our common ancestors with them. So we had a common ancestor with orangutans about 12 billion years ago, a common ancestor with the ancestors of gorillas about 8 billion years ago, and a common ancestor of chimpanzees about 5 billion years ago. And then you have hominins, and then eventually humans. And you can look at the sort of biological things that are there. What we know they're hardwired because they don't have culture. Chimpanzees have the capacity for language. They're wired for it neurologically just by chance, but they don't really use it. We can debate to use it when teach a chimp or a gorilla to sign, or a orangutan to sign. They can understand English if you put them in an English environment. They'll grow up in an English speaking environment or in language speaking environment. They'll learn the language, but they don't have any apparatus to speak it because they're not wired for that. But so you teach them sign language or give them a computer, let them make nice figures. They can type it out on pictograms, and they can talk to you. So they have that capacity. But there's still no culture in the human sense, symbolic culture. We can represent almost anything, a feeling, any thought, or any experience with symbols. That's unique to humans. So you can look at and you can see what's our biology. It's right there if you just pay attention to it. Look at the field data on great apes, and look at the neurological data on how the brain's gotten rewired by natural selection for humans from great apes. And when the great apes, you can assume, are very much like their common ancestors of us. So it's there. And so what I did was try to say that here's the biological legacy. Now this got fed into what I call the elaboration machine of heightened emotions, larger cortical capacities, language, and culture. And out comes still these complexes, all of which have a biological basis. They're affected and elaborated by that elaboration machine, but they are still biologically based. And they're these complexes are called complexes because they're complex. They're not just one little thing. So there'll be 8 or 9 things that comes out of the, say, in the cognitive complex, and even more on the psychological needs complex, or the interaction complex, the emotion complex, a little bit less in the community complex. And these are, I think, these complexes are what drive us as a biological organism. All overlays of culture and language, but still is a biological basis. And it dovetails nicely into this analysis here. If you can see why these things in the suite lead to altruism and cooperative relationships, because they are compatible with the complexes that I've identified as what we can know about human nature. You can't fully disengage culture from biology when you're talking about humans, but to the extent you can, this is as far as best you can do, I think, until we have new technologies that we may never have to really figure out what the brain is doing in every instance. But so that was the goal. So it's fascinating. It's I can't say any more about it anymore because there's nothing more to say. I used all the data that are available, and this is what I came up with. And I actually read this book, Blueprint, after I'd finished the first draft of the Human Nature book, and I said, "Damn, a great big thick book that I ought to read." And I'm glad I did, because I found it fascinating, and I put in these 2 or 3 pages in the book in there, and it supported what I was basically doing. So, but he doesn't have a real he can't read. He doesn't have, even though he's an MD, Christakis, he doesn't have a biological explanation for these things as much as I can tell you why these work, because of because we are descendants from primates, and he doesn't have a very good vision of he doesn't know that much about primates.